I have no family left now that my ex and my son have cut me out of their lives. So here I am sharing what will likely be my last words with strangers. Please excuse any typos. I've never been good with words and I know it's only a matter of time before I'll be unable to write anything ever again. Marlo, Nathan, if you're reading this, I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused. I should have paid more attention to the red flags. Maybe if I had, I wouldn't be holed up in a dark closet in someone's basement, surrounded by a puddle of my own blood. He had looked so nervous when he showed up unannounced, introducing himself as Dave. He'd studied my house as we walked through to my office, as if trying to memorize each detail. What struck me about him, besides the odd smell that clung to his clothes, was how timid and soft-spoken he was. I had to coax him into actually taking a seat and making eye contact with me. Once he did, though, his stare was unnervingly intense, almost predatory. I need you to watch my wife. I nodded. It was a fairly common request, finding out where the spouse, fiancé, or significant other was going during the day, what they were doing, and oftentimes, who. It isn't the most exciting type of job, but it typically pays fairly well, and usually ends up being safer than many I've taken over the years. After the recent accident with the new metal rod in my leg, I was all for something low-key. I laid out the terms of my employment, how much I charge an hour, all of that, as he nodded along, never once breaking eye contact. What's your wife's name? He stood up so abruptly that he knocked his chair over and leered at me, eyes narrowed. I tensed, putting my hands up placatingly. I thought he might come over the desk. He shuddered as if trying to shake himself out of it, and then sat back down. Sorry, he laughed nervously. Of course, you wouldn't know that. We sat in silence for a moment. I considered sending him away, but I needed the money, and he'd offered to pay the full amount up front, in cash. The downside of the work that I do is that you tend to meet people that, while at their worst, while they are desperate, afraid, frustrated. I made a mental note to try and rent out my old space from before the accident, so in the very least I wouldn't be having these types of meetings in my home. Where do you think she's going? I need you to watch her sleep. Now that gave me a pause. Of everything I'd ever been asked to do, something about that made me more anxious. It was her request, he added, perhaps in response to the concern written on my face. And why does she need someone to watch her sleep? He smiled at me for the first time, a bit too widely. You'll see. I figured that at least she'd been the one to request that I be there, which, while still strange, felt less intrusive. At the time, I wasn't sure why he hired me to watch a sleeping woman at $100 an hour. When that night came, as I sat in my car, I felt my anxiety spike. I'd never done a job like this before in my life, and while strange, it seemed too good to be true. No crouching in bushes, sitting in a hot car for hours on end, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the image. The momentary crack in Dave's calm persona, the absolute abhorrence with which he looked at me. It all felt wrong. I told myself it was fine. I was just on edge after the accident, and did my usual pre-driving ritual. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Wait, start the car. Their house looked like your run-of-the-mill colonial from the outside. Well-manicured lawn, cheery flowers, baby blue siding, a porch swing. The inside? Well, the inside was a different story entirely. When Dave opened the door, cobwebs floated through the air from where they'd been disturbed, drifting through the pale moonlight. Dust coated nearly every surface I could see. I clutched my light coat to my body to keep from shivering after I stepped inside. It was a good 30 degrees colder than I kept my own house. The lights were dim, just barely bright enough for me to see where I was going. It wasn't the dust, or the dark, or the cold that fazed me though. It was the smell. From the moment I stepped over the threshold, it hit me. Faint but immensely unpleasant, like meat gone bad. Christy is upstairs. The only parts of the house I'd seen so far that weren't in total disarray were the pictures plastered along the entry hall. They were all of Dave with a striking blonde woman. His wife, Christy, I guessed. He looked so happy in them. A stark contrast to the waxen and grim-faced man I'd come to know. As I kept walking, I passed an end table with pictures of just her. Little trinkets were laid out, a woman's engagement ring, a lock of hair. I realized what I was looking at. It was a shrine. My heart pounded at the thought of what I was possibly walking into. As we approached the dark stairwell, the smell intensified. I still don't know what possessed me to stay. Dave started up the stairs and, after a moment, I followed slowly, clutching the banister and making my way up the best I could. Bad leg? I nodded. By the time we reached the top, the smell of decay and rot had become so strong that it made my eyes water. As he slowly opened the door to the bedroom, I held my breath, both to keep the fetid air from my lungs, and also out of anticipation of what I was about to see. On the bed, bundled up under blankets, was the woman from the pictures, Christy. To my immense relief, she was alive, albeit asleep. There was a single chair facing the bed, which Dave gestured to. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked as I plopped down none too gracefully. I nodded appreciatively, staring at Christy, still unsure of what was happening and what exactly I was supposed to do. I was surprised when he came back with an entire bottle of whiskey. I asked if I could take him up on some water instead, and he looked me up and down, before walking away again without a word. As I stared at the small figure in the bed, pale and delicate-looking, blonde hair around her like a halo, I realized she looked so familiar. I wondered where I'd seen her before. I only had a moment to ponder that before the bottle struck me in the head. The last thing I remember was the sting as alcohol seeped into the wound, doubling the searing pain. When I awoke, I was in a partially finished basement. I felt the cold cement on my cheek as I opened my eyes to see that Dave was inches from my face, smiling at me. I sat up, woozy. I was near a drain that was flecked with bits of soggy tissue and clumps of hair, and the rancid smell that arose from it hit me in a wave. Blood had stained the concrete. There was far too much of it to just be my own. I managed to prop myself up and then fought the urge to vomit when I saw that a tuft of black hair, still attached to the scalp, had been pinned under my arm and was stuck to my bare flesh. "I'm calling the police," I whispered the empty threat hoarsely. I doubted I could fish the phone out of my pocket faster than he could do whatever he had planned for me. I highly suspected that he'd just tossed me down both flights of stairs. My entire body was throbbing with a dull pain that battled the jagged cuts along my head for my attention. "Sure." His laugh unsettled me. Please do that. Please tell them how an unlicensed PI is at my home at 3 a.m. reeking of alcohol. Tell them how you're here to kill my wife a second time." Jesus. I suddenly realized why Christy looked so familiar. It was only for a moment, but it's still imprinted on my mind no matter how hard I try to erase it. I shouldn't have been behind the wheel. A part of me knew I wasn't up to driving. I could have called a cab, an Uber, but I didn't. Her mouth had formed a perfect O, blue eyes wide. Of course, she was surprised. She'd been driving on the correct side of the road. She wouldn't have expected to suddenly see headlights pointed at her as I barreled down the small highway going 75. Her reflexes were fast, but in her panic, she'd swerved too hard in the opposite direction, and I'd heard the sound of screeching metal and shattering glass as her car wrapped around a tree. I made it out without so much as a scratch. It was almost as if I'd never been there at all. It was a miracle she'd survived. But no, she hadn't, I reminded myself. I'd have stuck around if there was any chance she had still been alive. It was too late. I could tell by looking at her car that there was nothing I could do for her. The news later confirmed my suspicions. Died on the scene. I had a wife, a son, a job, my entire life ahead of me. Later, the guilt and self-loathing would end those relationships anyways. But at the time all I could think of was what I stood to lose if I got caught. "How is she still here?" I whispered. "Oh, now you remember her." He flashed a bitter smile at me. "She was my world, Michael. I couldn't live without her. I found a way where I wouldn't have to. I managed to stand, but found myself backed against the wall. Remaining upright was a struggle. Dave continued towards me, unsteady, unhinged. There is no way to really, truly bring someone back. Not completely. No matter what you offer in exchange. She's not the same. I wanted to go after you as soon as I found you, but Christy, there used to still be a bit of Christy in there. She convinced me not to. But you did it again." He pointed his head accusingly towards my leg. "No one else got hurt this time," I gasped. "Never again." "I'm sorry, Michael. We just don't believe you." The floorboards above my head creaked. Something heavy was moving across the floor. "She's so hungry. It's been difficult, but when you love someone, you make sacrifices for them." I heard her footsteps as she descended the basement stairs. Slow, deliberate. I looked around frantically. He was between me and the only exit, and the windows were far too tiny for me to fit through. The only place I could hide was in a tiny closet on the finished side. I slid along the wall in that direction as he followed. I've seen it a few times by now. It won't be fast. It will take days of digestion before you're truly dead. But even that is still far faster than you deserve. She leaned forward and peeked her head down at me, grinning, her blonde hair a curtain through which her eyes glinted in the scant light. She moved unnaturally, and even in the shadows, I could see that her skin seemed to be shifting, like whatever was in there was aching to come out. Dave was transfixed as she strode towards us. The look he gave her as she approached was one of sheer adoration, even as what should have been flesh and bone began unfurling to reveal a gaping maw. As she came close enough that I could see the hundreds of teeth wringing the now fully open mouth. I swung at Dave blindly. I seemed to have caught them both by surprise, allowing me to narrowly avoid being pulled into the living darkness that had once been Christie. Instead, she only caught the lower half of my bad leg. The distinct feeling of flesh and bone dissolving away hit me instantaneously. She began to drag me backwards. I frantically clawed against the rough concrete floor, trying to pull myself towards the tiny closet, nails shredded, fingertips bloody, when I heard a meaty-sounding rip, and the resistance was finally gone. I tried to ignore the sound of the exposed bone and metal dragging on cement, tried to stay conscious despite the pain. I managed it just long enough to reach the small dark space, and lock the door from the inside. That was hours ago. I don't know what to do. I can't run, but even if I could, there is no way I could get past them. I hear them on the other side. Every so often Dave will whisper to her softly. I have no doubt that a flimsy door and small piece of metal will be no problem for something like her, whatever she is. The bits and pieces I found of others unfortunate enough to have met their end in this same closet confirms that to me. I don't know when she will decide to come for the rest of me. All I can think about is how any moment now could be my last. I cannot stop vividly picturing what my death will be like at her hands. This is not a plea for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I just need to tell someone what happened to me. I need someone to know what I did. I have a feeling that soon, this and a few pieces of indigestible hair, bone and a metal rod will be all that remains of me.